Once again, I always like to give you all a location of where we are in the course and where we're heading. We started off with the biblical theology, or at least the beginnings of thinking through ethnicity and culture in the Bible. And we tried to make this argument that every culture has elements of the imago Dei in it, the image of God, through the human creativity that arises from culture. But every culture also have elements that need to be critiqued and reformed in light of the Christian message. And that we tend to think that some cultures and peoples bear more the image of God reflected in their culture than others. And I disputed that. And I said part of what we want to do in this class is help us think through the ways in which the gospel has come into and made its way through the varied cultures of the world. But in particular, we wanted to look at how this functions in the United States amongst some of the ethnic groups here. And so we've looked at the African American community so far. We did a history. We actually did a biblical interpretation from an African American context. We went through a long history of the history and development of the Black church. We then went from there to start looking at elements of Black theology. Coming out of this, hopefully today, at some point, we will go into the Latino community. And I want to tell you some really interesting things about some of the stuff that you learn when you get there. So I'll preview this. And this shows you how, you talk about how social location can distort your perspective. So this class, and this shows you one of the flaws that I recognize, but it's a flaw that actually I think we need to keep. So it's not like a flaw that's going to hopefully ruin your educational experience. I grew up in the Black church. So we talk about how the Black church is a central institution. You have these 7 historic Black churches. You have the development of Black Christianity. And so I just thought when I went to look at the other traditions, Latin America, Latino Christians, and Asian American, they'll be the same thing. And I'm going to find where are the 7 historic Latino churches in the United States? And how has Latinos read the Bible in their own unique way, and what's the history of theology? And one of the things that I recognize, and this is going to become clear when we get to hopefully the Brown Church and other things later on today. The African American experience in the United States is unique precisely because, and this may sound superficial, but follow me through, precisely because of slavery and the hard break with Africa that results from that. So African American, as it relates to Black people in America, has to function both as a racial and an ethnic category. So the varied people of Africa who came over here, we don't really have a strong link to African culture. So African American functions both as, Black functions both as a racial category, but because our culture starts here in the United States and moves forward from slavery, it almost functions as an ethnicity. And then African culture, Uganda, Rwanda, Nigeria, have points of connections, but they're very different. And so telling the African American story and even telling the Nigerian immigrant story are 2 different things. So when I came to study the Latina church, I assumed that that strong division was also there. So I thought I could just pick the story up with America. What we're going to find out is that is a much more integrated story. So my even intention to focus on, because one of the frustrations that happened with me, especially in evangelical spaces, there's a lot of global theology, a lot of emphasis on global theology and mission, and not a lot of emphasis on the ethnic minorities here. So this class started as a rebellion. We're going to focus on ethnic minorities in the United States because in my context, there's a lot of emphasis on going to mission, but not actually sometimes going to the ethnic minorities who are down the road. But when I began to research the history of Christianity as it relates to Latino and Latina Christians, I found out that you can't, the border doesn't work. And the same thing happens when we go into the Asian American context. So although I attempted not to be global, this class is going to become more global as we move forward. Well, the reason that I did that is because I was socially located from the Black context. You see, it distorted how I looked for the story. And I was frustrated. I was like, well, where are the, and interestingly enough, you'll find, we'll get to this later, Latino pastors and Asian American pastors play a unique but a slightly different role in their communities. related, right, to some of it's going to be different. So all this to say is that we're here in the middle of kind of the Black theological enterprise, but going further, we're going to, hopefully this today, we're going to look at some of the history of kind of the western half of the United States and how it relates to Latino and Latino Protestantism. Okay, this is where we are? All right. So today, what I want to do this morning is finish talking through Liberation and Reconciliation by J.D. Otis Roberts. And what I think is, if we looked at Cone, who represents one strand of kind of the Black theological tradition, Black radicalism, and a particular understanding of Black power, it's always important to put him in conversation with his contemporaries. So we don't have a time to have a representative reading from all of the strands of the African American Christian tradition. But I think putting Roberts and Cone in conversation are important. And where we stopped, if you have your books, we're basically talking through the first 3 chapters. And I think that you all should have had your notes around this. I wanted to kind of open up the discussion around anything that we discussed in the first 2 chapters: theological discourse in Black, relationship between liberation, reconciliation, and the search for Black peoplehood. What I want to say, and this would be a good point to recognize what happens in, at least what I understand the development of Black theology, is J.D. Otis Roberts goes to Morehouse and ITC. I think that's where he spends the majority of his career, both of which are not doctoral granting institutions. So there isn't really a school of Roberts that develops through time. But Cone goes to Union and produces a whole generation of Black doctoral students whose influence is felt still in the academy today, like the theological children and grandchildren. This is the kind of language that we use in the academy. And so you do have a history of the constructive work that comes from the Cone stream of the African American tradition. And he's not the only one. But you don't have kind of a J.D. Otis Roberts school that kind of exists in the academy, because he went and trained pastors. So you don't see as much of his thought picked up and developed, I wouldn't say. He's mentioned in a lot of the histories of researchers, but there is no Roberts school. So you can see the ways in which people take Cone's ideas and develop them, but you don't see as much of how Roberts is developed. There's also an entirely different strand of research into the African American preaching tradition. And you can kind of see the development of Black preaching and Black rhetorical theology, if I can make up a phrase, that you see there. There's a book, if you're looking for one, called Methodologies of Black Theology. Maybe they said Methodology of African American Theology, by a guy named Frederick Ware. And it's probably one of the best books on this topic. He outlines kind of the different streams of African American theological reflection. And he kind of puts them in the categories. He kind of gives you kind of a genealogical outline. And then he talks about the different aims of different theological traditions. So he breaks them out into, I'm going to get them wrong, the hermeneutical school, where they're at least engaging with and interacting with biblical text. There's the philosophical school, and then there's kind of a sociological, this wouldn't be the term to use, a sociological school. So if you want to talk about Cone and Roberts, actually would come through the hermeneutical school. They're at least interacting with, engaging in biblical text. You could think of the philosophical school. You guys know Cornel West, kind of comes from that tradition. And then there's a more recent tradition that's looking at kind of a sociological approach to African American religion, and looking at kind of a huge emphasis on sociology and anthropology. I don't know if they would actually kind of put him in this category, but conceptually, I would think of someone like Willie Jennings and Conversion to the Imagination, if you know those books. So those are kind of the ways, if you want to see where African American theology goes, That book gives you a good outline of the different things that happen there. But I want to say, I think that there's a fourth kind of tradition. And that's what I talked about in my book, is kind of the Black ecclesial theology that continues to develop in the pulpits and sermons and lived ministry experiences of Black churches. And getting that into print and articulating its ways of being is a little bit tricky. Anyone else on the first 3 chapters from this actual room of human beings? Not that you aren't human beings. I love you online people. Talking about the incarnation. Pete.
I was really struck by in chapter 3, just the language of family.
Yes.
The role of the church
Yes.
in supporting the family, but then also like the family language and like informing the vision of the church. I just was really proud of that.
So one of the interesting things is me and a friend of mine had a conversation about this, is we're in this middle of this moment in the culture where the deconstructive phase, what we were talking about, all the ways in which these institutions are being challenged. And historically, the African American church has put a huge emphasis on kind of the restoration of the family, precisely because of the way the family was attacked during slavery. And they were talking about, there was one of the kind of things that came along that said, like, the nuclear family is a manifestation of whiteness, and it's, bad for all of these other reasons. And what I want to say is, and this relates to the family here, it is true that the nuclear family by itself is like insufficient. I think that very few people would disagree with that. But the question isn't whether or not we put the nuclear family in competition with the more extended family, but the nuclear family being the base from which the extended family kind of spreads out, right? So you have like the husband and the wife and the children and then the grandchildren, and then you have the grandmother and like the village that extends from there. But it doesn't mean that actual family unit as a thing that exists is insignificant. And so I think it is really important here that Roberts pushes back or articulates the importance of the Black family and the church that has a role to be a supporter of the family. And he talks about how the church can kind of be both kind of this replacement of a family in the context in which it's been broken down, and that the idea of brotherhood that exists in the church extends beyond your ethnicity. So it puts like the opportunity for this global family across ethnic difference. And this is once again where Roberts' vision opens up to the wider world. One of the things that I actually thought that he spoke about as relates to family that was interesting, he said that the family language in Christianity implies love for one another, especially love across ethnic difference. But love doesn't rule out making demands. I love my children, but they have to clean their rooms. Right? My wife loves me and I love her, but I have to like cut the grass and take out the trash and cook dinner and wash clothes, and I have to take up my role in the family. And if I sit around while she does all of those things, then she's gonna say, Esau, pull yourself together. So it does, the idea of the church as a family, that we're all brothers and sisters, does not rule out making demands. And so I can say that the white Christian is my brother, but precisely because he is my brother or she is my sister, there's some things that she needs to do for the other members of her family. And so Black theology then is this attempt to speak to the person who is experiencing life in America as a word to them. And when I talked about whether or not Black people should be in white churches, which obviously I think that they can, what I'm saying is that the pastor has to be able to speak to them. They have to be able to speak to them. Because what happens is, the moment that you begin to speak the word to that person in the congregation, there's someone else in the congregation who says, I don't want you talking to them like that. They want to keep the conversation in a way in which it's not a word to anyone, because if you speak a word to that person, it's going to challenge someone else. And so when I talk about having a multi-ethnic church, that's only possible if you have multi-ethnic preaching. In the sense that the word that we apply has to reach down into the lived experiences of other people. And here's the thing. If you don't have a multi-ethnic church yet, you have to preach as if you do. Because you never know when the person is going to show up. I used to have this idea when I was preaching. See, this is how it was when I was growing up. Some of you may have been different, have had a higher level of piety. But I had to go to church every Sunday. Because my mom said, too much Jesus can never be bad for you. But I had this idea in my head. I don't know where this idea came from. It's like, that pastor better preach really good. If he preaches really good and he convicts me, I'll be a Christian for another week. If he doesn't do a good job, I'm going to go and sin that week. So this is like what does he have? Because that's a lot. I'm in high school, right? There's a lot going on. And I'm thinking, I need a word from God to keep me on this road for another week, or I'm going to go sideways. And so in the weeks he preached well, I was thinking, you got me. I got to go live for Jesus. So when I became a pastor, that seems flippant. There's always, and maybe you've never been there, but there's always people who come to church like those last few times when they're on the way out of the church. And they're giving up on the community. And I always preach as if that person is in the congregation. And I say, it's my job to reach that person, grab them, and keep them in the body of Christ for another week. That's how I think of writing a sermon, with that kind of urgency. Because I was that kid. So what does this mean as it relates to when he talks about black theology and a word on target? We have to preach as if there are people in the congregation for whom these are life and death issues. And if they don't hear a word on target from the church, then they're going to leave. I tell every pastor, and maybe you all will figure out how to do this. I've never seen it done successfully. Everybody who's been a pastor or who's led a church over any period of time kind of begins to understand their congregation from left to right. Politically, forget about theology, politically. But the theology is there too. And as it relates to the sufferings of the oppressed or injustice, people know, no matter how carefully I interpret this passage, no matter how accurate my exegesis is, if I engage this topic, then this portion of my congregation is going to be upset. This portion of my congregation often, interestingly enough, has a lot of money. And these are the tithing units. This is like what keeps the doors open. And so you have to either say, in my preaching and teaching, I will never go anywhere that upsets this group of people in the congregation. If you do that, if this is the buffer that you can't go beyond, it is almost impossible to consistently minister to people of color who have any kind of social consciousness at all. Because we know that those people exist, and we know that you're afraid to upset them. So you have something like the Charlottesville incident. And we walk into church, maybe a majority white church, and we wonder, what is the pastor going to say? It's a question. We know if we're in an all-black church, what's going to happen. It's not a question. So when we talk about a word on target, so there may be a way to keep both of these groups happy, but I've not seen it done successfully. And what I've seen done time after time after time in majority white churches is that this group, even though they're not the majority of the congregation, determines the preaching tone of the congregation. Because there's this group, and then there's a huge group of people who are concerned and who don't know what to do and what to think. They're just confused. They're Christians, so they know there's something's going wrong in society, but they don't understand how to do it and how to think about it theologically. And they actually need pastoral care. And in absence of pastoral care for you, they just kind of retreat back and they go to whatever they see on the news. There's another section of the community that's really aware, that's already concerned about these issues, and they too need pastoring. They need to understand how this issue is seen through the lens of the gospel. So there's a chance to pastor the whole congregation into a theologically coherent mode, but we're oftentimes afraid of this group and what they will do and what they will say. Because for them, any articulation of anything related to this is a manifestation of liberalism. And what I want to say is, like, if the gospel has to come to the person, he calls him the slum dweller, then as a pastor, if we choose the wealthy over the slum dweller, what does it mean about our preacher? And I say this about my own Anglican tradition, my denomination. Sometimes we are scared to death. We are terrified of actually pastoring our people through this. Okay. Another Robert's ism, page 39 and 40. We're going to stay in the same area for a second. This is his definition of black power. So this is down at the bottom. Page 39 and following. He's talking about like blackness, right? Revelation. This is actually in the middle of 49. The revelation of the address of God to blacks is both personal and social. It is existential and political. You see the both and here? It is concerned with earthly material things as well as heavenly things. When God reveals God's self to persons, something happens in heaven and something happens on earth. So blacks must not make the same mistake as those who've been successful in the things of this world without God. Neither must religion be an opiate and escapist theology. God's revelation to blacks is at once meaningful for personal existence and the means towards the humanization of life. This is the reason why I like Robert so much, because he balances. And you have to understand, put this in conversation with liberation theology, like one version of liberation theology, where the focus is on the freedom of the person in this world, right? We plunge ourselves into the world on behalf of the poor. This is what Cone says. And Robert says, sure, this is part of the Christian message. It has to relate to our earthly life. But he says you can never lose the spiritual. Then on page 40, he talks about black power. The making known by God through the revelation of his creative purpose for human life and sure goodness of that creative act make it undoubtedly clear that black too is beautiful. The revelation of God as creator and redeemer makes it abundantly evident that it is not given to anyone to rob another for human birthright. Right. Henceforth, one will be able to repeat with James Brown of soul fame, that strange prophet of the Black Revolution, I'm black and I'm proud. The black person, upon understanding God's address to the self as black and poor, despised and rejected in a racist society, is assured in the sight of God that he is somebody, a child of God. This is the Imago Dei, lifting black people up. One of the things that I talk about that I noticed in black preaching and black theology and kind of the white theological tradition more broadly, and this is what I mean when I talk about things in a different key. White theology, I shouldn't say, some forms of white Protestant theology, some is always implied in there, influenced by kind of the evangelical revival in the context of kind of evangelism, starts with the person is the sinner, the humbling of the person so that you can articulate to them the grace of God, right? This idea that you're bad. By the way, I do think that people sin and need the grace of God. I'm talking about how the system works. You're bad. You've committed sins. You've offended God. Therefore, you need to trust in God, by his grace. All those things are true. But when you exist as one of the people who've been put in a theological category of being bad by definition, right? That when you've been the articulated as the wretched things of the earth, then the Christian gospel actually begins with the Imago Dei. You are a child of God. You are loved by God. So you didn't need so much in the African American context to articulate a theology of human brokenness. We're told that we're broken. The idea that despite our brokenness, we are good things created by God, and that God loves us enough to send his son that we might be reconciled to him, the gospel takes on a different key. And so the emphasis on the lifting up and black dignity that you see in black theology is just not the exact same, because the Imago Dei doesn't have to do the same amount of work in the white community. It may do it, and you see this in other contexts, right? Where, to be honest, the best analogy I can think of are like teenage girls have poor self-image. And the idea that they are loved by God as things that are created and beautiful. And how God's word to them isn't they're struggling with anorexia or poor self-image, that you're a wicked sinner who God desires to save. It's actually you're fearfully and wonderfully made. And so when he talks about the black assertion of self, this is the weaponization, in a good sense, of the Imago Dei. I want to turn to a couple of more of these. Bottom of 43 and going on to 4. This is the Bible in the black theological tradition. This is the middle of the last paragraph. The biblical record affirms at once the distance and the nearness of God. The God of the Bible possesses all the exalted attributes of the African high God, but in addition, the biblical God is closer than breathing and nearer than the hands or feet. The God of the Bible is creator. This God is also the provident God who is savingly present, the God of the Exodus, the God of the exile, the God of the prophets of social justice. The God of Jesus had a special appeal to the people of bondage. God is not merely present, but is present in power. The black preacher has found the book of Daniel extremely attractive. Even if God wills to act contrary to human will, as in the case of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego of the book of Daniel, the moral honesty and ability of God are not questioned. This is the confidence that blacks have placed in the God of the Bible. This faith has nurtured and sustained black people. It has brought meaning to their hopeless existence and has been a means to physical and psychological survival. By the way, in case you're wondering where Reading While Black comes from, African American biblical interpretation is an exercise in hope. You hear that? So when he talks about the Bible and the African American tradition and how it actually pushes back on African religion, he says that the God of the Bible is not just high, the God of the Bible is the one who has come near. And that in the story of survival in the context of oppression, the African American Christian finds deep identification. And this is like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is an important story. Do you know what happens in this story? What is the speech that they say before they go into the lion's den? No, the fire, right? The fire. Do you remember what they say? No, well, what's the part before that?
Our God will save us, and even if he doesn't.
Even if he doesn't. This is the part he's talking about. Even if he doesn't. Even if he doesn't. The black confidence in God is a confidence that says, in the God of the Bible, in death or in life, God is glorified through my faithfulness. There's a section in Reading While Black. It's probably my favorite section of the book. You guys aren't going to love it, but I love it. Sometimes as a writer, you got to write for yourself, right? My favorite story in the Bible is Zechariah. Well, my favorite book in the Bible is the Gospel of Luke, chapters 1 and chapter 2. Best written stuff in the Bible. It's not even a question. It's not even a question. But it starts off with Zechariah and Elizabeth, you know? And Zechariah and Elizabeth are these two old people who, despite their old age, haven't had children, and Zechariah has functioned as a priest for a long time. And the question that I ask in that book is, why does the story begin with Zechariah and Elizabeth? To what point is it showing? Like the other gospels start with Jesus. And this is the reason why, and this is going to get to like the African American context of what he said about the God of the Bible. Zechariah and Elizabeth represent Israel, who remained faithful under oppression for centuries and had nonetheless not giving up on the God of the Bible. And they had done so in the midst of deep disappointment. They didn't have any children. And Zechariah was a priest, and Elizabeth was from a family of priests, correct? So they knew they have to go, they're ministering to a people who are the stepped-on peoples of the world. Do you not think that at some point somebody came to Zechariah and said, why should I go to the temple? Why should I offer sacrifices? Why should I, get myself cleansed from impurity? Well, no matter what happens, the Roman Empire is going to be there next week. And you can imagine that members of Zechariah and Elizabeth's community, their friends had abandoned God at some point along the way. Right? You can imagine this. This is Israel, first century. But Zechariah and Elizabeth hadn't. And so God's beginning with them. God's beginning of them to give them a child is a vindication of long faithfulness. That's how it functions in the narrative. And then the child, John, he is kind of this virus of hope that begins to infect the community. And they begin to ask the question, what might this child be? I compare Zechariah and Elizabeth to Black grandmothers and grandfathers who dragged us to church when we didn't want to go, who kept faith in God during Jim Crow and segregation because they knew in their hearts that God had not abandoned them. There's this sermon that is given to on the occasion. I might get this wrong. I think it's the freeing of the slaves in D.C. And they saw it as the foretaste of God freeing all of the slaves. And they thanked the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob for granting their freedom. They said one day all of the slaves are going to be free. And so like this freeing of the slaves, I think it's in D.C., functions as a virus, giving hope to other Black people everywhere. And I want to say that in the African American context, the child of hope, John, the one who was born, is the Black church, right? The Black church is born in the context where the freedom of Black people is not at all clear, in the same way that John was. But Black freedom, the freedom that we ultimately experience, and the continued freedom that we get is a vindication of the faith of our ancestors. Right? We are free now. So then that causes us to ask the question, right? In the same way that I think Zechariah and Elizabeth pushes back on the cynicism that had to mark the existence of Israelites in the first century. I think the faith of Black Christians in the 17 and the 1800s that is vindicated by the advent of God for their freedom. And that's what they say. They say that the Civil War was God's act to liberate Black people. You can read it in all of the sermons of Black pastors coming out of that time. So then you're wondering, as you look at the Black church, or as they look at John, right, what does this mean? And what I want to say then is that African Americans have for centuries put their faith in the God of the Bible. And in my sense, we can say there's not enough evidence. In my sense, there's something to be seen in the witness and the ministry of the Black church in their fight and struggle for freedom that vindicates that hope, that causes us to question our skepticism. And so when I talk about where I find Roberts very, very helpful as a corrective, it's the robust affirmation that he places, the robust trust of God that he affirms, the God of the Bible that he sees here, and his ability to keep these things in creative tension as he begins to articulate a Black theology, material and existential. I think someone asked about this last time. I'm going to keep doing this, at least in this middle chapter. Turn to page 56, where he talks about the fall in racism. This is at the very bottom of page 56, the last paragraph. This is really interesting. The creation of human life and the risk of love are inherent in God's purpose and activity as a creative spirit. Thus, the fall of humans has first to do with their estrangement from God. God and humans belong together. They are not strangers, but they are estranged. Strangers have never met. They come together for the first time. The estranged, a man and his wife will separated, overcome separation through reunion. The brokenness between God and humanity is the basis of sin. This includes the sin of racism. Racism is self-glorification of skin color and all the rights and privileges associated with it in a society in which white is right. Racism is the exaltation of the finite to the status of the infinite. Whites desire to be gods to blacks. They are angered as blacks respond, "We have no father on earth, for our Father is in heaven." What do you think of, because someone asked about the link between the fall and racism. I think it was online yesterday. Was it you? So what do you all think about this idea, the link between the exaltation of the finite to the infinite? There is language that you see about America's original sin being racism. You see this a lot in Black theological discourse, and it's extended on. What they are trying to say is not that Americans don't have original sin, or that original sin isn't really rooted to your alienation from God. It's something along this, right? So at the founding of America, it's in part this assumption that white is right and blacks and native peoples are inferior. And so part of what America has to wrestle with is how far are we willing to go to undo this fundamental flaw in how we see the world? I think that he is correct. And one of the things that happens, and this is something I've been trying to think about, this is not unique to America. I think the best thing that ever happened to me was when I went to live in Japan. And when I lived in Japan, and also being an Anglican helps. When I moved to Japan, I started to learn about the history of like China, Korea, and Japan. And then I was living in Okinawa, which is an island, like a little island off the mainland. And Okinawans are ethnically different than mainland Japanese. And the Okinawans that are victims of discrimination, they're a little browner, a little shorter. So you can kind of tell someone who's Okinawan if you're in Japan. So I saw how the racism against Okinawans, and I saw the history at different times and different, eras, like China was on top, Korea. And then I took a step back as an Anglican, and I started looking at tribalism in parts of Africa, where one tribe puts themselves against the other tribe. So what we experience in America is not unique in the sense that we found ways to put people on a hierarchy. Every culture does it. And the cultures with Christianity and cultures without Christianity do it. It's in Hinduism or in India, right, with the Buddhist caste system. Not the Buddhist caste, the caste system in India. And what I'm saying is that there seems to be something about the human condition where we find ways to ascribe value to things in order to give ourselves a sense of the excuse to exploit other people. And this does seem to be something endemic to the human condition that's linked to the fall. Because when this is Paul, like we replace God with created things. So there's a sense in which racism, as it relates to the United States, I've shown this in Africa, Asia, I just don't know. Actually, in Brown Church, they get to this too, where there's the value of direct Spanish descent. So the question is, why does this happen? Is it ultimately a faulty understanding of God, who God is, and what the image of God resides in? So I think that in this sense, the struggle for racial justice is the fight against the fall itself. And in that sense, I do not believe that racism will be overcome until the kingdom comes. But that doesn't mean I don't fight against it. I think that this is true of all sin, right? Will greed ever be completely done away with? No, like every generation has this propensity to greed, there's a propensity to lust, there's a propensity to dishonesty. And so if these things are elements of the fall, we should as a church be honest about them and then put all of our energy of fighting against them as a manifestation of God's coming kingdom. And if these things are elements of the fall, it means that we don't just inherit the progress of a previous generation. It has to be reacquired in every generation. So like, just because your parents are 20% less greedy, you're not born with that 20% of less greed, right? You have to, in your own life and in your own heart, fight against greed. But one of the things we think about racism is that we develop an evolutionary idea that society always moves forward in the battle against racism, and we can just bank all of the things we've already done. But as it relates to any sin or manifestation of the fall, there can be times where you go forward, times you can go backwards. And if you look at the history of this country, there's always been, for every racial step forward, always the backlash against black people. You look at it coming out of the Civil War, you have the Reconstruction, end of Reconstruction. What do you have? Jim Crow. You have the Civil Rights Movement. What comes out of the Civil Rights Movement? The war on drugs, mass incarceration. We have, and this, you have to be able to see this. We have our first black president for 8 years. Is it really surprising that the racial chaos happens in the aftermath of that? It's called the black tax. Because you don't get to just bank the progress. Right? That's not how it works. I talk about, I get to use the Lord of the Rings analogy, right? So you have the battle, the great battle for Middle Earth. They win, like the ring is, if I can get my ring off, the ring is tossed into the fire. But then they have to come back to the Shire, right? Sorry if you read the books. The movies never happened. All right. They have to come back and they have to fight in the Shire for the freedom that exists. They don't get to just download and say, well, we won the battle, therefore you all should go away. The message hadn't gotten there, so they have to fight for it. And so what I'm saying is, if he's correct, that racism is tied to the fall, that's linked to the human tendency to put the finite in place of the infinite, then it's something that we have to be on the lookout for in every generation. And if we see it exists in every culture known to man, and it can't just be the influence of Christianity or anything else, because you can find it in Hinduism, you can find it in parts of Japan and parts of Korea and parts of China. You can find it in Latin America. It's a global problem. Then it requires our best efforts.